So to wrap up the autonomic nervous system, we're just going to do a brief review of the anatomy of it, just so we kind of remember what parts are doing what, especially in terms of the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions and how things are innervated. We'll talk about some organs that are singularly innervated versus those that are dual innervated, talk about how the brain controls the autonomic nervous system, and then talk about the reflex arc and referred pain. So the sympathetic or the thoracolumbar division, this is induced when we are stressed. It's our fight or flight system. And one big thing we notice with these is that we have this like two neuron chain, right, where the one is originating in the central nervous system, and then we have ganglia that we meet up with, and then the postsynaptic neuron is going to then connect to that particular organ, right? So we have what we call preganglionic and postganglionic neurons, right? Preganglionic neurons they're originating in that kind of we'll say like the mid spinal cord area, T1 through L2, right? So we're meeting kind of right in the middle there. And then we come out and we form this sympathetic ganglionic chain, right? So this chain is relatively close to the spinal cord. So the ganglia are going to be relatively close to the spinal cord. Lots of different ganglion, a couple other little ones that come at, or they pass through that chain. And so we have some, like when we look at those that innervate the visceral organs, like in terms of like the intestines, like gastrointestinal and like reproductive and urinary ones, we notice that those ganglia are a little bit further off and not part of that chain. But everything from like the heart up, right, definitely follows, like they are going to synapse at that chain. And we get this like widespread stimulation through what's called divergence. So the preganglionic neuron can branch and synapse the ganglia at any level. So this is going to be what allows us to act as a single unit for mass activation. Preganglionic neurons at different levels synapse to one. Postganglionic one, this is convergence, because several have converged to one single point, and this can cause us to be more limited in stimulation. So divergence allows us to connect and branch to many to have widespread activation, whereas convergence is opposite. So most of the sympathetic nervous system neurons, they do form that chain. However, that's pretty much going to be for those that are above the diaphragm, and that for anything that exits below the diaphragm, they use collateral ganglia instead. So we see like the inferior mesenteric, the celiac ganglion, right? These are all, and again, look at like what they're innervating. It's generally things involved with the GI tract, as well as things like reproduction and urinary output are going to be below that diaphragm. And when the axons leave the spinal cord, and then so the ganglions are going to be off of that chain. The adrenal glands is one thing, though, that is going to have direct innervation. There's a single neuron going from the spinal cord to the adrenal medulla. So this is part of that mass activation response for stress. We don't have a second neuron in this chain, so we don't have to worry about, the synapse between the pre and post synaptic neurons. We don't need to worry about ganglia here. It's just direct innervation, right? One single neuron going from spinal cord to the adrenals. On the parasympathetic side, it's a little bit different. So this is where the ganglia are further off. So in the sympathetic side, we saw the ganglia were relatively close to the spinal cord. But in the parasympathetic side, the ganglia are actually closer to the effector, closer to the organ or tissue that's being innervated. So the preganglionic neuron has really long fibers, right? It's coming from the spinal cord. We're looking at either the very top or bottom, right? The very, very top, kind of in that brain stem region from the cranial nerves, or down in the sacral region. And we see that these chains are, not chains, but these fibers are really long, and then they're not going to, innervate the organs until, we get to this ganglion that's like really close. So like here, it branches off. Here's our ganglion. It's closer to the salivary glands. It's closer to the eye, the lacrimal glands, whatever, right? So the postganglionic neurons are short. They don't have a long distance to go from the ganglion to the effector. I'm not worried about you memorizing a ton of stuff here. You've already done that in anatomy. So I'm not going to, beat this into the ground, but you should at least know that major structural difference between sympathetic and parasympathetic in terms of like where the ganglion are, how many neurons we have, and then what neurotransmitters they're using. So if we look at the cranial nerves and the parasympathetic, because we are using cranial nerves, namely some of like the last ones or some of the later ones, with the exception of the ones for the eye. So the oculomotor nerve, which is cranial nerve 3, this is exiting the midbrain to innervate the ciliary muscle of the eye, so for muscle control in the eye, so you can move your eyes around. The facial nerve, which is number 7, right, exiting the pons for the nasal mucosa, the pharynx, the lacrimal gland, salivary gland, so a lot of basic facial structures being controlled there. And glossopharyngeal, this is for salivary glands. And then vagus nerve, this is a big one, the vagus nerve. The vagus nerve, you notice, kind of takes care of everything from like the neck down, or from below the neck, I should say. We see that it is innervating the heart, the lungs, the esophagus, the stomach, the pancreas, the liver, the intestines, right? It's covering the viscera, basically. The vagus nerve is covering the parasympathetic division for the viscera, whereas the others were focused on things that were like up in the face area, right, in the face area. And then if you go much farther down, right, so the bladder and everything, we have the ones down in the sacral region to help with that. So the sacral nerves will handle things at the very end, like the end of the colon or the large intestine, the rectum, urinary and reproductive organs. And so that will be a sacral nerve. So most of our visceral organs are going to be innervated by both sympathetic and parasympathetic, because a lot of times parasympathetic and sympathetic work opposite of each other, right? For the sympathetic side, we increase heart rate. For the parasympathetic side, we decrease heart rate. Digestion, right? Sympathetic slows it down, parasympathetic speeds it up. Pupil diameter, right? Sympathetic dilates it, parasympathetic constricts it. So we see that these two systems kind of work opposite of each other, and this is one way that we are able to maintain homeostasis overall. In general, the sympathetic nervous system takes us out of a homeostatic situation, takes us out of homeostasis for a short period of time because of emergency situations, whereas parasympathetic brings us back to that baseline. Right? When danger is gone, we don't need to worry about that anymore. And so we're going to, we're not going to worry about increasing the heart rate. We're going to be more conservative with energy. We're going to be more focused on long-term survival actions like digestion, whereas sympathetic, we're worried about immediate survival. And so, quote, wasting energy is not a problem, because it's better to waste energy and survive than be too conservative with energy and then not make it through the emergency situation. Now, some are only sympathetic, and that generally is going to be the adrenal medulla, because, that's just, it's going to make epinephrine, norepinephrine, so it either makes that or it doesn't. Same thing with like the muscles in the skin and the sweat glands in the skin, and some blood vessels, because with sweat glands you're either sweating or you're not sweating. So you get activated, you sweat, you don't get activated, you're not, that sympathetic division's not firing, you're not sweating. So there's a couple like exceptions, but generally speaking, most things are innervated by both sides, right? With just the exception for those couple. Right. Instead, again, it's just the nerve activity. The more nerve activity from the sympathetic side, the more active they are, right? The less activity, the less they are. It's more like a switch, right? It's on or it's off. And then a lot of functions are regulated by autonomic reflexes. So we get a sensory input, it gets sent to the brain, which integrates the information. We make a decision of what to do, and so like the brainstem is gonna, and the hypothalamus is gonna help with a lot of this. The medulla oblongata controls a lot of your basic, keep you alive functions like heart rate and respiration rate and whatnot. Other parts of the brain will help regulate the medulla, so like the hypothalamus, things like body temperature, hunger, thirst, your pituitary gland are controlled by that. Limbic system will be for emotional state responses, so sweating, heart rate, blushing. Cerebellum for motion sickness and nausea. And then, so you'll feel like nauseous, right? If your cerebellum gets like confusing signals of, am I moving? Am I not moving? How am I moving? Right? That disconnect or that confusion can present as nausea. And then the frontal and temporal lobes for emotion and personality. But the autonomic reflexes, right? Again, this is just, so for example, the pupillary autonomic reflex, this is your pupil changing size in response to the amount of light available. So sensory input, how much light is available, sent to the brain. The brain then goes, okay, how much light's available? This is too much light, shrink the pupil down, or it's very dark, there's not a lot of light, open that pupil up. So just remember there's two different types of reflex arcs. There's a somatic reflex arc, which is the skeletal muscles. This is like when you tap below the knee and you get that leg kick. Autonomic reflex arc, this is going to be your visceral organs, your eyes, right? And these can occur via the spinal, cranial, or splanchnic nerves. They're very similar, right? The overall, like, we have a stimulus, we have a sensory receptor, we have a sensory neuron, it carries it into the central nervous system. We integrate, right? And then we send a motor output in response to an effector, right? That's all pretty much the same. Some autonomic arcs, like those happening in the enteric nervous system, so like in the GI tract, that can actually bypass the central nervous system. We don't necessarily see the central nervous system get involved. It kind of stays all peripheral. So you just take a look at the picture here. Just again, it's not too crazy. We do see that we have that two motor neurons in sequence. That's one major difference too between the autonomic and somatic reflex arc. Now, you're usually not aware of your, like, how your visceral organs feel. You're usually not, like, consciously aware of, like, how does your stomach feel? How does, like, and I don't mean, like, oh, you feel hungry or anything, but, like, the actual feeling of them. Like, you can feel sensations on your skin, you can feel sensations, right, like that. But you're not always consciously aware for the most part. However, sometimes they do make it to conscious awareness. And so if the sense is strong enough, you will be able to tell. The thing though is that we tend to feel, when we do get those visceral sensations, we tend to feel them in weird spots. They don't happen, the feeling doesn't happen in the spot where the organ's at. It doesn't happen where you'd imagine. So we call this referred pain. So referred pain, right, is basically like there is the somatic and the visceral senses there, right, where they connect, where those neurons connect at the spinal cord, they tend to connect at the same level. And that's, again, because the autonomic sensory neuron and the somatic interneuron, like there's an overlap there to some degree. And the brain gets, I guess you could say, confused, and it's not sure where the signal actually originated from. And so sometimes your brain assumes it's coming from the somatic side. So you feel this on the somatic end. It's not a random location, though. It is very much like a pattern in terms of where the referred pain happens. So for example, I had laparoscopic surgery done, and when I had that done, one thing they do is to give themselves room for tools, they will add carbon dioxide into your abdominal cavity to kind of almost like inflate the abdominal cavity to give space for tools. Well, that carbon dioxide irritates the phrenic nerve that serves the diaphragm. The diaphragm gets irritated, which then triggers the phrenic nerve. The problem though, or the weird thing is that when you come to out of surgery, you wake up, there's still some left over, there's still some irritation, but you don't feel it in the diaphragm. You feel it in your shoulder. And that's because of where the crossover happens and where those two body parts, what level of the spinal cord handles both of those body parts. So the shoulder and the diaphragm are handled at the same level in the cervical spine. Right? And so that's why you feel it that way. Another one that people may have heard about but never really thought of it as referred pain is the pain someone can experience in their left arm when they're experiencing a heart attack. That's another thing that is, again, referred pain. There's no problem with that person's arm. Their arm is fine. The problem is in the heart. But because of this kind of crossover, because of how things synapse together, we feel it in the left arm. Right, so it's an interesting thing. So here, if you want to take a look, look at this picture that kind of shows where people can feel pain for different organs. I mean, we see that ureters, you can feel it in the front pelvic area, but you can also feel it in the inner thigh. Right, we see that the lung and diaphragm, again, you see that neck and shoulder region, just like I said that I experienced when I had to have a surgery. We see the heart, we can feel it in the back, we can feel it in the chest area where the heart's at, but also down that left arm. Right, so just take a peek at that to get an understanding. You're not going to have to memorize this or anything, just have an understanding of what referred pain is and why it occurs.